So today we're going to be moving on from chapter 2 to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we begin our conversation about members of kingdom Plantae. We're going to begin that conversation by discussing some of the evolutionary adaptations that plants must have obtained to be able to exist in terrestrial ecosystems. But before we talk about that, I want you to just pause the video for a moment and just think about what characteristics plants have that make plants plants and not members of other kingdoms, right? So what characteristics would distinguish members of kingdom Plantae from some of the other kingdoms that we've discussed so far? So I'm going to take a look and share my list, and hopefully there are some overlaps between our two lists. The first one is that plants lack mobility. In yesterday's discussion around protists, we looked at several protists that could move either using their cilia, using a flagellum or multiple flagella, or even creating pseudopods, those false extensions of their cytoplasm. So we also know that from our own experience that members of kingdom Animalia, by and large, have some sort of ability to move from one place to another. But plants are typically firmly rooted in the ground. Let's look at what other things I have on my list. I have that they are eukaryotic, right? All members of kingdom Plantae, by definition, must contain cells that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. That is what we would expect for all members of kingdom Plantae, right? And so we know that there are protists that have both of these characteristics, right? Some, like Plasmodium, for example, can't move on its own. It must be sort of travel through the bloodstream of the organism that it's infecting. It's also made up of, it is unicellular and eukaryotic. So let's take a look at some of the other distinguishing factors. What would make a plant different than, say, Plasmodium? Well, they're cell walls, right? So cell walls in a plant will be made of a polymer called cellulose, and cellulose gives it some strength, some rigidity, and some additional protection. So far, hopefully you're doing okay with this. And the last is that they're autotrophic. So plants, by definition, are autotrophs. They will produce their own food via photosynthesis. So there we go. That's the overview of the basic characteristics of your average typical plant. What I want to do next is I want to start to categorize or break down all of kingdom Plantae into some sort of subcategories. And then what we're going to do is we're going to follow that up with little mini conversations around each of those subcategories within kingdom Plantae. So let's do that. So imagine that we have all of the members of our plant kingdom. And by the way, there are about 300 to 500,000 plant species. And so this is an estimate, of course, understanding that, there might be some issues with categorization taxonomists might be encountering with respect to that, or just some disputes around that. But we can classify plants into, let's just first break it down into two sort of large categories. We have what are called our non-vascular plants versus our vascular plants. So I want you to think about, from your own experience, what it means for an organism to have a vascular system. So a vascular system describes a network of vessels that can transport materials around the organism. So we will often refer to our cardiovascular system, and of course the human cardiovascular system includes the heart, but it also includes our veins, our arteries, capillaries, arterioles, etc., right? So all of our blood vessels. So what distinguishes a non-vascular plant from a vascular plant is the presence of some sort of a vascular system, okay? And so the classic example of our non-vascular plant is the moss. And you're going to be exploring a little bit about the differences between non-vascular plants and some of our vascular plants today. And so if we think about mosses, just to get sort of the ideas flowing, mosses are typically very low to the ground. right? They are limited in their ability to grow taller, and that is largely due to the fact that they don't have a vascular system to transport materials, and that would allow for them to become more complex. Vascular plants, of course, there are a whole lot. Most of the plants that we would know about are vascular plants, and so we're gonna, keep talking about that. So vascular plants, we can divide those into two different subcategories there. So we can talk about plants that have a vascular system but don't have seeds. And we can talk about vascular plants that have seeds. And so the classic example of our seedless plant is the fern. And we'll be learning some scientific names around that. As well as, and then there's our plants with seeds, and that we can break down into two further categories that I think we're probably not going to get to today, which is that we have some seeds that we would consider naked, and those organisms are called gymnosperms. We also have plant species that contain seeds that are enclosed, and those we refer to as angiosperms. So what I'm hoping to get to today is to talk about our non-vascular plants and our vascular seedless plants, and we may possibly, depending on the workload today, get to our vascular plants with seeds. But that is the overview. That is the breakdown of what we're going to be looking at in the next few lessons. So around about 400 million years ago, we know that plants, we began to see in fossils, via fossils, the fossil record, that plants evolved into being solely aquatic, to being terrestrial, or being able to sustain life on land. So this is kind of how we suppose that it happens, and the fossil evidence, the fossil record seems to support that, is that many species, with storms or whatnot, or high tide, would have washed up on shore, right? And so you can envision that plants are just washing up on shore. And of course, those early aquatic plants would not have been able to survive on land because they wouldn't have had the necessary adaptations to be able to do so. So they would have just died, they would have decomposed. And what they did is they formed our basic soil. And sort of like, you can take clippings and put them in a compost, and with the right set of conditions, they will help to become a nutrient mix that you can add to existing soil, and help to grow your garden. So that would have formed and sometimes we call those pioneer plants, because they're forming those sort of the basic soil, and then they grow on basic soil. So that initial soil level that was created by those plants that decomposed after washing up on shore would have changed what we call a microclimate, so that specific environment, and that allowed for future plants to be able to begin to sustain life. You can imagine that this wasn't an overnight process. This is a process, an evolutionary process that would have taken millions of years. But to survive on land, there had to be some very specific modifications, some very specific mutations that came to be that would allow plants to be able to thrive on land. And of course, those that were not, did not gain the necessary mutations would have simply died off, right? Survival of the fittest, natural selection. So let's talk about what those modifications are. Okay, so first, plants would have had to have some sort of support structure, right? So you'll recall that plants in the water, that water acts as a buoyancy kind of a buoyancy helper, as it were, that would help them to kind of stay afloat, stay upright, and so on and so forth, right? So that was the problem. Okay, the air doesn't provide that buoyant support to keep our plants upright. And so a couple of modifications needed to kind of come to be. So let's think about, well, what adaptations would have allowed plants to be able to stay upright on land? Well, there are a couple of them. Okay, so early plants, they would have had these hair-like projections. If you've ever pulled a mushroom out of the earth, then you might have seen what look like little mini roots. They're called rhizoids. And so rhizoids are sort of primitive roots. More recent plants, those rhizoids evolved into being full-grown roots, and that would have helped the plant to stay kind of anchored into the soil, so that if winds or tides again came by, they wouldn't be sort of knocked over and uprooted. They also have a cell wall. Plants now have cell walls made of strong cellulose that helps to protect them from damage and also helps to give them their structure a little bit of rigidity. So that's the first modification. The next problem arises with transport structures, and we talked a few minutes ago about vascular systems, right? So if you're a plant and you're living in an aquatic environment, then you are getting all of the nutrients that you need by way of the water. The water is just, that plant is bathing in the water, and the nutrients are just kind of coming to it, and that water is also going to remove waste. Air is not really able to do that as efficiently as is required by the plant. So that was a problem. And so what was the solution to that? Well, over time, our plants developed special vessels, vascular tissues we call them, to allow for nutrients to move throughout the plant. And we're talking about plants that are, a little bit more complex, a little bit taller. They would need to have ways of getting water from the roots to the shoots, and also to take any food being created in, maybe taller plants with leaves. Any sugars that are produced in the leaves need to find their way back down to the roots, possibly for storage, for in terms of if the weather goes cold, then that plant needs to be able to survive the winter. So those sugars help to create a bit of almost like a winter cellar for that plant. So I want to talk a little bit more about what these vascular tissues are, just very, very simply, not in a whole lot of detail. For those plants that do have a vascular system, we typically will break the vascular system into two big categories, the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem is the vessel that carries water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. So in other words, from the bottom of that plant up to the top of the plant. And that's a pretty huge feat. Like, think about some of our our Muskoka pine trees, and that water moving from the roots against gravity all the way to the shoots, to the very top of those pine trees. That's pretty incredible. And in grade 12 biology, we talk a little bit more about transpiration pull theory and how water is able to make it up to the shoots, but pretty amazing feat. So the xylem is the vessel within the plant, that vascular tissue that carries water from the roots to the shoots, so upwards. The phloem, on the other hand, is a vessel that's going to take those nutrients, like for instance sugar being made at the top of the plant. Typically we see more leaves there that are responsible for the rate of photosynthesis is going to be high in those leaves, not so much further down. And so we want to take that nutrient and store it for later on. So the phloem would be responsible for that. And the phloem, I think of, the phloem has that O in it, like down, so phloem and down. So what would be moving down? Well, the sugar would be moving from the leaves down to the roots where it gets stored. And so I think about it also like a carrot, right? If you think about a carrot plant, well, carrot will, grows in the ground, and really what we eat of the carrot isn't the plant part that kind of is growing above ground. We eat the sweet, if it's a nice summer garden carrot, we eat that sweet root, and it's really delicious, right? The plant's not really trying to feed us. The plant's just trying to get as much sugar down to its roots as possible. That's what it's trying to do, is just kind of survive. So, but we benefit from that. So there we are, xylem and phloem. The problem is that aquatic plants at the time, did not have protective structures that would protect them from drying out on land, right? If you're bathing in water, if you're existing in water, that's your environment, you're not going to have to worry about drying out. But on land, that exposure to air would cause plants potentially to, some of them, those that didn't have an appropriate adaptation, to just dry out and die simply because the water would evaporate out of them. So what's the solution to that? Well, the solution is that, many plants have very obvious cuticles or waxy layers. And so that prevents those leaves. And you know what I'm talking about. We see them a lot in tropical plants, and we see them in some fruits and vegetables. I'm thinking about an apple. They'll have a waxy layer that is waterproof, and that helps to prevent not only from nasty stuff getting in, but also from excess water evaporation. And that would cause, cells to shrink and potentially die within that plant. So what do they have? They have that nice waxy cuticle, which prevents excess evaporation, prevents dehydration in plants living in a terrestrial environment. So the next problem, or the next, I guess, bridge that needed to be, a gap that needed to be bridged, has to do with reproductive structures. So if you are an aquatic plant that is existing in an aquatic environment, your reproductive cells, which have the special name of gametes, which I'm not sure if that was brought up in grade 10 science or not, would have just been sort of transported through the water, right? And so I want you to think about, well, how do plants distribute their gametes in a terrestrial ecosystem? Chances are you can name a couple of different adaptations. Let's see. So the solution is that terrestrial plants developed very specific adaptations, and different plant organisms have different adaptations, and I've just listed a few of them. So we know that some plants have nectar, and why is nectar helpful in distributing gametes? Well, insects will land on a plant and might prefer specific plants because of their nectar, and in so doing will grab onto some pollen and eventually land onto a different plant. And by doing that, we'll cross-pollinate. So that's helpful. Sometimes certain insects are attracted to flowers of particular colors or odors, and so on and so forth. And so that's an attractant that will help to distribute pollen. We know that certain animals like to eat fruit. And so fruit contains seeds. And so when an organism consumes fruit with seeds and then that fruit moves through its digestive system, it will release the seeds in a separate location that may better provide a suitable environment for growth. Right? Spores as well. We're going to talk about spores a little bit more in a later lesson. But spores and then our seeds actually contain the embryo that seed might come in different forms. I'm thinking about we have those maple keys in Muskoka, lots of maple trees. The maple keys that sort of, will fall through and have like a helicopter-y sort of spinning motion, and that allows them to get far enough away from the parent tree so that they can capture enough sunlight to be able to grow. And that's one of many. And if we were in class, I would have loved to hear your contributions to the conversation around this. So I look forward to maybe touching on that tomorrow. So I'm going to suggest if you have time today or in the upcoming days, take a peek at these homework questions that are in your textbook just to get a sense of your overall understanding. Maybe don't do that right away. Maybe leave it and come back to it in a little bit. I know most of you are probably going to be studying for tomorrow's quiz on viruses, bacteria, archaea, and protists. But take some time at a later point to maybe take a look at these questions just to gain a sense of your own understanding, and of course reference the solutions manual that can be found on my website.